Hello, everyone. It's lovely to have you along today. We're very pleased to have you join us for the systems mapping webinar. Just a heads up, we are recording this webinar. There are so many people that the chat is not being monitored, but if you do want to interact with us, then please use the Q&A function. So please make sure you post your questions in there. And I'm going to hand over now to our co-chairs for a welcome and acknowledgement of traditional owners and some framing for our seminar. And then we will go straight over to Fiona and Eve from Orange Compass. I'll be joining you at the end to handle any of the questions that come through on the Q&A. So all the questions we'll save up and we'll keep them for the end. So allow me to introduce from the Front Project, Jane Hunt, and from Aracy, Penny Dakin. And I'll hand over to the two of them. Penny, all yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. The Early Years Catalyst are really excited to be able to present today's webinar for you. This work has been a long time in the making, and we are delighted to finally be in a position to release it back to the field, the people who actually contributed to the development of the work. I do want to begin by acknowledging that we are all joining from various traditional lands around the country, and from the very earliest conceptions of the Early Years Catalyst through the National Early Years Summit in March 2020, one of the founding principles of our work was that we wanted to place First Nations children first, and we wanted to make sure that we privileged the voices of First Nations people in the work that we did. So I acknowledge that we're all coming to this webinar from different traditional lands. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country in the very cold national capital, but we'll be hearing voices in today's webinar from Gadigal country, from Wadawurrung country, from Wiradjuri country, and possibly others as well. And we want to extend our respects to the people and traditions of the lands where you're all coming to us from. We want to show our respect to the stories and inheritance of our First Nations cultures that have honoured and held close the well-being of their children for over 60,000 years. And we hope that this work is a part of contributing to that ongoing role that First Nations families play. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Jane Hunt, who very ably co-chairs the Early Years Catalyst with me. And Jane's going to provide a bit of a contextual background for the work that we're going to reveal to you. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Penny. And as Penny mentioned, the Early Years Catalyst was a direct result of the participants in the Early Years Summit in 2020. They were calling for new and better ways of working together, ways that were innovative, bold, and collaborative. And it was because there was agreement at that summit that the current system design and interventions, despite the amazing people and the efforts of everyone in the field as a whole, the system is still not delivering substantially better outcomes at the scale required, nor are they addressing the root causes that perpetuate disadvantage and vulnerability for children. And we know there's an urgency in our work because we've all experienced systems and services where children in their first 2,000 days are falling behind or experiencing vulnerability and disadvantage at levels that seem to be intractable and stubbornly resistant to change. And we know this is something that requires all of us working together, but first and foremost, we needed to understand the full challenge ahead of us. So what we did is we started by commissioning Orange Compass to engage with people like yourselves across many services working with children and families to help us understand the very things that are at work in the systems and are keeping the current conditions in place. So what you are hearing today is just the first part of the conversation we want to have with you all. The full report will be available on the website tomorrow, and it stretches to almost 100 pages of insights and possible ways we can all act to create a changed early years development field, one that delivers change at a systemic level that we're all looking for. So once Fiona and Eve from Orange Compass have shared their work, we would like to invite you to contact us, because the other thing we're preparing is a series of workshops which can help you all, everyone, to take this work and apply it in your context. And so we would love to continue this conversation with you and this work with you as we all use this to inform your work, but also the work of the Early Years Catalyst in developing our strategy, the next level of work and engagement with the field and with government, including our newest ministers in the federal government. But let me introduce you to our special hosts, Fiona and Eve. Their hard work, insights and analysis have given us a truly remarkable and unique report that will challenge all of us in the work that we do. So over to you, Fiona and Eve.
Thanks, Jane, and thank you, Penny, and thank you so much, everyone, for turning up. It's somewhat daunting. Often when we talk about things like system mapping, you don't always get a big audience. So we're really grateful to have the opportunity today to share with you some of the work that's being covered in this process. And probably just to say, the reason that report is almost 100 pages is just because of how rich and how amazing the participation was of everyone involved, and we really wanted to do justice to those insights. So our challenge today is to take essentially 9 months of insights and try and share that with you in about 25-30 minutes. So we're going to cover a range of things, including essentially how we framed the work and what we focused on. A little very light touch on the approach. We're not going to bore you too much on method, but really happy to answer questions on that. Some discoveries, we're going to take a slice from the current state mapping and then also desired future state mapping. So we did both of those. And then also talk about what that meant in terms of the sense making that we did with all sorts of participants from across Early Years Catalyst and beyond around what does that mean for leverage points for changing the system. And we'll just finish with a couple of observations from ourselves, Eve and I, just on the work, having come in and had this privilege to do this work, and hopefully share with you some thoughts that'll get you thinking and want to be even more involved in the work as we go forward. So I'm going to hand to Eve first to help us frame up the focus.
Thanks, Fiona, and it is a great pleasure to be talking to you about what turned out to be an amazing experience for us. In terms of our focus, the goal of the systems mapping process was to identify the root causes and deep systemic forces influencing early childhood development outcomes and possible leverage points for change. So that was the tiny task. And the focus was around building a shared understanding of the many interconnected systems that support the health and wellbeing of young children and their families in Australia today. So to do this, we needed a working definition of the influences of early childhood development outcomes. And so what we did, given the systemic nature of the approach, was to create a broad definition that was intentionally really broad by combining ARACE's NEST framework and the Centre for Community Child Health's core conditions, which you can see in this diagram here. And we did this to recognise that children's development takes place in connection with parents, carers, families, and that all of these things have influence. And the definition resonated with those who engaged with us, and it enabled some broad and deep reflections and insights about the systemic influences on ECD outcomes. In terms of our approach, it was intentionally as participatory as we could make it. So there were 4 stages to it, which are set out here on the slide. But in terms of the engagement, just a note to remind everybody to cast their minds back to sort of November, December last year, when everybody was totally over COVID and particularly over engagement on Zoom. So we are incredibly grateful to the more than 300 people who did engage with us through workshops, interviews and surveys. And the engagement process, one of the benefits in some ways of doing it online was that we had people participate from rural, regional, metro and right across Australia. So we got the broadest sort of possible engagement, and we sought intentionally to seek the sort of insights from people who have lived experience of how the early years system currently operates and how it impacts children and families on a daily basis. So we heard from frontline workers and people who are working with children and families. We had feedback from families themselves, and we also talked to people with unique perspectives, experience, expertise around the early years field. And we particularly wanted to call out the natural capacity of people who work with children and families to see the interconnections between the systems. And so when we had these conversations, people could naturally connect all the systems and tell us how it actually worked for children and families, and where the sort of pain points were and where the good bits were. We also did a rapid review and a desktop synthesis of the sort of the key pieces of thinking and the position papers around ECD and what needs to happen. And it all came together in this process.
So in terms of approach, we, as you would know, did systems mapping, but systems mapping is a really broad term for quite a few different methods. What we focused on was really the methods we felt would best help support a shared understanding of the system or sets of interconnected systems, how we could actually surface what we call underlying patterns and deep systemic structures and forces. So things like mental models, the deep purpose of the system, structures, policies, etc. And then from that, be able to identify different points of leverage for transformation. So as I said, there's many ways to do system mapping. Our choice was to do both causal loop mapping and iceberg maps. We were able through both of those to do current and future state mapping. Just on causal loop mapping, there's a lot of probably mystery in some ways around how you do it, but it's actually not that hard. So what it's really focused on is capturing stories of the system. How do people experience the system? What causes that? And what are the consequences of that? And we're really trying to map cause and effect in that way. So what you will see in these maps is essentially what's been an adaptive sense-making process that's evolved over time through all sorts of different inputs, but also that it represents a point in time. So it represents a point in time and a set of perspectives. A system map is not a sort of a Google map of the world. It is a map of how people are experiencing the system. And it's really a way to make the invisible visible and make also visible connections that we might otherwise not see. So essentially that was our approach. And as we said, we mapped both current and future state. So what we're going to do now is take you through a little bit of that in terms of the current and the future state. We'll start with current state. And really just to say that the focus, as Eve said here, was really about what is holding, in some ways, the problem broadly defined in place. How does the current system operate? What are some of the everyday events and patterns that are experienced? And then what are some of those real life examples of the consequences of that on children and families? What was really interesting in the current state work is that it revealed a whole range of participant experiences, like Eve also said, around that complex interplay. People are living these interconnected systems all the time, those underlying patterns, structures, and mental models then that are coming up in that experience. And all of those things are essentially holding what we see as those unacceptably high levels of disadvantage in place. So we are going to just give you a snapshot. We're going to give you a very quick broad overview and then a snapshot of one or two examples within the map, noting that the website and the report and the maps will all be available online from tomorrow. So current state, we'll just start here firstly with the idea that we know there are many strengths in the current system, but that was not the focus necessarily of the conversations for a whole range of reasons. I guess if you're turning up to talk about the system, you're not just going to turn up and talk about how wonderful it is, you're also going to focus on what are those challenges. And so those undesirable outcomes and root causes became really clear in a lot of the dialogue. The common theme was actually ways in which the current system undermines agency, particularly the agency of families, and issues with the ongoing or decreasing level of community connection and empowerment. There was also a really interesting focus on universal and secondary platforms across health and other systems, and some really confronting information and conversations around things like early intervention and how hard that is in a context where health and allied health services, for example, not the only ones that have such long waiting lists. So we heard a lot, particularly in some of the rural and remote areas, about this as well.
Someone had to do it. It was me. Apologies. So in terms of what emerged around the deep systemic forces that are underpinning the current system, what we found were 7 categories. And so you can see these here, from deeply held societal beliefs, care logic, child and family experience, market logic, government logic, sector logic, and reform logic. And for each of these categories, a number of feedback loops, so the causal loops Fiona showed you just before, were developed. And there were over 30 of those in total. And each loop reflects a narrative or systemic force that is currently holding the system and the outcomes in place. And so when Fiona's going to show you in a moment sort of individual loops, but when you go into the system maps online, you can go into the loops and you can see each of them and each of the individual sort of pieces and explore it that way yourselves. But Fiona's going to show you how it works. She's going to give you a navigation tour.
Thanks, Eve. So the end product is essentially this big map. It looks scarier than it is. It's essentially capturing a whole lot of linked stories and deep system forces. As Eve said, there's colour coding based on the categories, whether it's government, market, care, logic, etc. And that's going to be available online, and you can interact with the map in all sorts of different ways. The example we wanted to share with you was just one of them, which was around the yellow in the map, which is deeply held societal beliefs. So essentially there were some deeply held beliefs. We haven't censored the language. We haven't tidied it up and made it politically correct or anything like that. We've really just tried to capture and honour what we heard. And these deeply held beliefs are powerful because they're the things that actually inform purpose of a system, how policies are framed, how structures work, what we're actually trying to achieve. And some of the beliefs that we really heard a lot strongly about was this idea, firstly, about a society that essentially tolerates poverty, the sort of stopping at the front door. So the whole concept of families being private and therefore a lot of early detection of other things being a challenge. Assumptions around how parenting happens magically. This idea of stigma and othering those with disability or experiencing other challenges that sort of frames them as the exception, and they get treated in an exceptionally not always positive way. And even the idea of good and bad mothers, which is quite a provocative statement, but it really is deeply held in some of the beliefs, and people are observing the consequences of that. So an example here of a specific loop, when you dive in, if we start just on the top right, inequity justified by the belief that poverty is an individual's fault. That might not sound logical, but it actually is the way our whole welfare system is essentially set up. It informs a whole range of other things. Belief that poverty is actually part of our market, belief that government should not or does not intervene in the market leads to a whole range of market failures of which no one is held accountable. There's a set of structures, therefore, because they're not inquired into, that are actually holding sort of power and disadvantage in place, which means you've got a whole lot of unaddressed social, environmental, economic determinants of disadvantage that are quite deeply held. And what you also see then is that polarization in postcode, which is reinforcing that belief that somehow in certain locations poverty is inevitable. So it's a really confronting example. We've probably picked one of the most confronting loops to share with you. And whether or not you agree with it, the question is, what does it mean that people are experiencing it this way? They're feeling the system does this. That really becomes the question. So there are a whole set of different loops in the map where we've pulled out these different narratives and stories, and then we've linked them to other drivers. So across the map, there's all sorts of linkages throughout them as well.
The other approach we took was to develop some iceberg maps. And so iceberg mapping is another way of mapping the systems and essentially answers the questions that are set out there. So what do we see every day? What patterns do we see repeatedly? What structures hold the system in place? And what underpins all of that? So what are the mental models, the root causes, the deep narratives that sit below those? And iceberg mapping can be really sort of intuitive for people, because you go, yeah, okay, if that's what we see, there must be something that sits underneath it. And so what we did was take some of the detail from the causal loop mapping and translate it across into icebergs to illustrate it that way. So we created 5 iceberg diagrams, which you will find in the report. So one's an overarching summary, and then we just picked 4 of the key feedback loops, which demonstrate the sort of the linkage between the deep narratives and the sort of deep forces right at the bottom and what you see at the top. And so the 4 that were illustrated was this notion that the family is private, that market-based solutions are better, that care is not real work, and governments are not accountable for system failures. And so this is our pretty picture. And so this one is about market-based solutions are better. And so what you see at the top and what families and children are experiencing is the lack of access, disadvantage due to location, choice being an illusion, etc., etc. And it was really interesting how often the market-based approach and the sort of commitment to market-based solutions being the way to do it impacted children and families right across systems. So from health and allied health, ECEC, all sorts of systems that influence ECD outcomes are impacted by this sort of belief in market-based solutions being the best way to create the structures for service delivery.
Thanks, Eve. And that's just one snapshot of current state. I probably just want to emphasize again that the way we do system mapping is to capture people's experiences of the system. It's not an objective map. It's not necessarily this is the only version of the system or the only experience, but what we want to do in this work is honour what we've heard. So this is experiences of the system that people, particularly across in frontline, across rural, remote and regional Australia, are saying they have experienced it as. And that's what they believe are driving some of the outcomes. So it becomes really interesting when you interrogate these maps to think about, well, if you have a different view, what does that mean? And what does it mean that others are holding a different view to you? It's really gets into this, the whole point of mapping is to get into a dialogue then about what might those causes be and how we're all experiencing them differently. So what was really exciting is, yes, we talked about current state and what's holding the problem in place, but we also talked about desired future state. And this was where probably in some ways energizing and inspiring, but also really quite amazing suggestions and ideas that people were holding really passionately about what the future could look like from across the field. So the engagement, the question we asked consistently across all forms of engagement, whether it was survey, interview or workshop, was if you had a magic wand, what is one thing you would change so that all children and families can thrive? And what's here is that firstly, everyone had an answer. So there was strong aspiration across the field for a distinctly different and better future early years system. There was some really strong emphasis on some of the things that are probably less visible to people in the way that current systems are at least formally framed. So the significance of relationship and relational aspects, the avenues that when you're working in community of trust, of connection, of all the things that happen when you're actually building a response, but also power dynamics and other connections that are shaping early childhood development came into play. And really interesting future wishes. We've just included a small sample here, but this idea of imagine if community and wellbeing was put above economic outcomes and individualism. So it was actually this call to collectivism, this vision around culture, and actually a really interesting challenge around what does care, what is the care logic? So if you're thinking about care, everything from, and we're not calling early childhood development only care, but we're saying in the context of care, really what does that mean in 2022? What does care mean across Australian society? People are exploring this right up into thinking about aged care, but just that broader challenge about what does it mean to support others in 2022 in our changing society? And then even visions around things like data sovereignty and data empowerment and using evidence-based approaches at a postcode scale. So some really interesting pieces there.
Again, what emerged were some deep themes and some systemic forces and narratives that would underpin the future desired state system. What was remarkable was how consistent and how shared this vision was. So, of course, there were sort of people's differences around the edges, but overall, there was a really, really strong consistency around the themes. And as you'll see, it's not a mirror image or a reversal of the current system. It actually is the imagining of a new system, including new values and structures and forces that would underpin this sort of system. And so there are also significantly less sort of themes or loops in the map, and perhaps this is a reflection of the desire for a more coherent, joined up system. And so the 5 categories were around the lifelong wellbeing of all children in Australia, strengthening families, parents and carers, strengthening local communities, accountable, high quality and proactive ECD systems, and government that holds responsibility for the whole.
So again, you have the big map color-coded here across those 5 themes with various feedback loops inside them. And again, that'll be available online. It's a really nice, when you're looking at the 2 maps together, it's one is an antidote for the other in some ways. You're like, oh yes, I can see where this is going. And really interesting, I think, as we said before, deeply held beliefs about the future, but also some deeply thought through ideas. But really, when we just as an example, which is really focused on what are the systems that support or wrap around families? How can we make them more accountable, high quality and proactive? There was obviously the idea of finding ways to be preventative, but actually that meaning it has to address a whole range of other things in the current state map. The accountability for outcomes piece, so picking up where there is at the moment the sense of a lack of accountability, or sometimes between the gaps between systems, whether it's health and education or other things are falling through the cracks. A reimagined universal platform, there was a lot of thinking here around the idea that what if something was opt-out rather than opt-in? What if it was less stigmatizing or less targeted or less based on deficit, and we flip the whole framing around to some sort of a stronger platform that works for everyone? And then obviously service system, high quality workforce, this is front of mind at the moment for a lot of people as well. So I would imagine a lot of these are familiar. And what's interesting is when you unpack what that could mean. So some ideas that came around accountability for outcomes could be, for example, are there updates that we need in legislation or other to help create those accountabilities? We did also speak to people in government and talked about, silos work really well for really good reasons. There might need to be changes if there were that broader accountability to be held. The sort of idea then that all actors can be held accountable, not just those. Some are probably hyper compliant at the moment and others are probably missing out. And also reflecting though the real challenge here, which was interesting, about how do we even measure, if we're focusing on care, connection and relationship, what does that even look like for a framework? So there were some substantive challenges around what would an evidence-based approach to something that was actually community-centred, child-centred, how would we reimagine that and how would that get embedded? So some really fascinating conversations and ideas and thinking around that as well. So again, it's just a sample. What's been really great about this process is we've been able to sort of unapologetically reflect back to you what we've heard. And really, I think as the earliest catalyst is taking up that role to basically say we're conveying the voices from the field. So really fascinating and interesting. And when you dig into it, you'll see things that you might have known and some things that you might find are surprising as well.
Thanks. So we also did some future state icebergs. And so again, there's an overarching summary and then four separate ones that reflect key sort of feedback loops. So a society that prioritises the wellbeing of all children. The work of care is essential for a resilient and prosperous society. Government is accountable for the whole ECD system, and strong communities support strong families. And so this is just the example of strong communities support strong families. And again, what it does is map out what you would see on the surface and what we would hope to see if there are strong communities and supporting strong families, but also underneath that, the patterns of behaviour that you would see, the systems and structures, the mental models and assumptions that would underpin this, and the deep narratives. And if you were to compare, you would say that there are some really strong differences between the current state and this sort of vision for the future state. And this one was a particularly strong theme that reflected the view that the key, or one of the key elements to changing ECD outcomes, is to build stronger families in stronger communities.
Thanks, Eve. And so that's just a very quick and brief snapshot of some of the insights you'll gather from looking through the mapping process and essentially what the field has told us. So what we've heard and what we've done our best to honour and capture in as many ways as we can. There's more information in the report about who took part and some of the demographics and other things as well. The whole point of doing system mapping is not to come up with a map to somewhere like a Google map, as I said before. It's actually to support dialogue and conversation about how do we get from here to there. So really a key element of this approach was ongoing participatory engagement in a second round, where we actually talked then around, if these are the maps, if this is what we're hearing from the field, what does that tell us about what might be needed in order to change the system? We did that through online briefings and workshops, further surveys, and also a 2-day workshop with a host of guests and participants in Canberra as well. And really the powerful conversations here were about what would it take to influence some of those deep forces. And what was really interesting in that, and again, this is just a sample, is obviously there's the high level ideas, but then what sits underneath. So for example, some of the most, I guess I would say popular leverage points were around big societal shifts. So how do we shift the identity of society to actually prioritize well-being? How do we actually create recognition that raising thriving children is the work of a nation, it's nation building? And there's some bigger questions in that of the how you might do that. Likewise, some of the interventions, this need for or wish for a bipartisan framework that actually crosses all the ECD systems in some way, that creates, overcomes some of the jurisdictional fragmentation and all the other divisions of responsibility between state and federal and all of those things. But that's not insubstantive, because you're not only talking about crossing different systems, it's actually also talking about addressing some of those factors that were identified that are holding disadvantage in place. So for that, addressing inequality itself. So these are big nation building ideas. The fit for purpose funding and commissioning, really interesting point here about one way to drive accountability is to fill that missing feedback loop in, the one that comes back from community and children and families, to actually go, it's not just a feedback loop between the funder and the service provider. We're bringing community into that triangle and giving them a voice as well, all of which has lots of ramifications and complications and things, and really interesting dialogue about how they could happen. So you can see how the way that the mapping works and highlights some of the threads actually then supports those conversations about what the future could look like. So again, a lot of that is outlined in the report as well. So probably just to finish, Eve and I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts about the process, a couple of key takeaways. And we thought as a little bit of a teaser to make you open up to page, I think it's page 64 in the report, so you have to read to page 64. This was where we tried to capture how do we get from here to there, so that going from current state to future state and what that might mean and what the contrasts are, all in one slide. We're not expecting you to read it all now, but we thought we'll share our insights while we're showing you this slide. Eve, what are your concluding thoughts?
Our overarching thoughts, which I don't think would come as any surprise to anyone who is sort of deeply involved and committed in the system, is that the mapping process itself revealed a whole lot of forces that influence behaviour and outcomes, some of which were surprising, some of which were much stronger than we might have thought they were, some were less so, but that they are there. And that the vision for the future that emerged is so much more than extra service provision or extra resourcing. It's actually a rethink of the way we approach it. And so it is from a systemic perspective that PACE, as Fiona said, about how do we shift the deep narratives and the mental models that underpin ECD systems. Overall, also a really sort of strong theme from everyone we spoke to about acknowledgement that there is no silver bullet for this issue. There's no one intervention that's going to make all the difference, and that there's no one organisation or no one initiative that's going to be the thing. That maybe the silver bullet is in convening and connecting and collaborating, and everybody who's invested in this working together in a different way.
And I think I'd just add to that and say, so the bottom line here is if we want a different future, it's not enough to just amplify current patterns or ramp up current resourcing. That's great, but it's not sufficient. It's actually about doing things differently, thinking differently, and changing some of those fundamental underpinning system structures that will help us get from current to future state. And essentially what this is calling for is if we're seeing a set of patterns of behavior and of thinking, how do we change those patterns in order to create a new system? It's only by breaking or changing some of those patterns that we'll actually see that shift. That's everything from deep purpose and intent and challenging some of those deeply held mindsets right through to how we frame the conversations that we might have as a collective. So this is really an invitation to say, here's insights from over 300 people across Australia who care deeply about the future of children in Australia. This is their thinking and ideas about both what is holding the challenge in place and what the future could look like. And really the invitation from here is to join in and think about, well, what would it take? What is your vision for a future? Is it different? Is it the same? And how do we work together to actually reach a threshold or nudge this so that the change is fundamental? So that's probably enough of a bit of a, if that hasn't convinced you to take a look at the report and everything else, I'm not sure what will, but hopefully it's got you thinking and some ideas, and we'll hand back to Jeff.
Thanks to the Orange Compass team. You've been an absolute joy to work with. One of the highlights that I've had is being able to meet with these two every single week as we've gone through the process. And I'm really going to miss that as we move ahead, because our meetings are less often, but it's just been fantastic. And I just want to reiterate that this is such a taster of this work. You know, we could have run this workshop probably for 8 to 10 hours, and we probably even wouldn't get into the depth of the material. So there's just so much here. There's just a rich depth of data and interesting pieces, insights that can be mined and explored. And you know, reiterating Fiona's point, is about creating dialogue, creating that engagement. And to that, we want to make sure that we're actually answering some questions. So even Fiona, I'm going to throw to you first, and Jane and Penny, I'll ask you to come back on as well, because we're going to throw some questions in here. Fiona and Eve, I want to throw to you first. And there's a couple of questions that are coming in about, you know, who was involved, who were the people that were actually contributing, how did you get different voices in, families, children, practitioners, government? Just give us a little bit more around that material, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, and maybe I can start, and then Eve, if you wanted to help add in, as I think you'll be more across all the specific numbers. So a range of different processes. As Eve said, this was during COVID, so it was online. So that was a one limitation, but it actually turned out to be an opportunity, because what we found was we had participants from Groote Eylandt, Ceduna, Emerald, Northern Territory, like all different places where if we'd have tried to convene everyone in Canberra, for example, they would have missed out. So we had people from Bourke, so basically every state and territory we spoke to people. We particularly reached out to through all the networks that the Early Years Catalyst holds, and also from the summit itself, that mailing list. We reached out to a whole list of different categories, I guess you could say, that we had. Everything from mental health to disability, to First Nations, to refugee services, to rural and regional and remote, place-based approaches. We tried to get a really broad brush. We also did the online surveys that we published, and they were open online. So we got a lot of parents that way through that process. I think the one thing that was we would love to see, and that which we couldn't do, was get direct access to children, but that we did get access to parents and families through the surveys and the other things. We also spoke to groups like Playgroup and you know, people working in you know, the sort of statutory services around child protection, really broad. And what we couldn't get through workshops and surveys, we targeted for interviews as well. So we did some one-on-one interviews and picked up the phone and spoke to as many people as we can. So we essentially had a very elaborate stakeholder map just to try and get a diversity of view. Our emphasis was, as we said before, really on that practitioner focus. We did speak to specialists, so-called specialists and academics from an academic point of view, but we kept that as a limited sample. We didn't want to make that the dominant voice. It was really about people who are working with the systems on the ground as well, trying to bring in that voice of difference. Eve, what have I missed in that answer?
I don't think you've missed any. I think it's, we did quite a lot of interviews that were quite targeted looking. We reached out to a lot of people and we're very grateful for those that we did speak to, again, knowing the time of year and what had been going on last year. But we spoke to a whole range of people who had really unique sort of expertise or perspectives about the way the systems, and we were looking particularly for people who had experience in the crossover of the systems. So I guess it's also just a call out to the lots of people that we did one-on-one interviews with who shared their expertise and their insights that added to it. So it was a bit of a melting pot of all sorts of different perspectives, and we really were aiming for as broad and as deep as we could go.
Thank you. Jane and Penny, there's some, and I'm sorry, I'm moving on quickly, but I don't, you know, great answers, thank you. But Jane and Penny, can I just throw a couple of questions to you that have come through about sort of what's the traction of this report with the current government talking about an early years, you know, the federal government talking about the early years review. There's been the changes at the state level around ECEC. And now, obviously, this is not an ECEC report. We're talking about the entire ECD field, but just wondering what your thoughts are around the crossover of this report towards those conversations and conversations with government.
I'll start, and then if I make any errors or miss anything, Jane can clarify. I think one of the things that's worth noting, Jeff, is it's a really exciting time for the early years work at the moment because there are so many pieces of work that are happening. Obviously, we've been doing this piece around the, you know, the deep systems mapping. The Centre for Policy Development and their Early Childhood Development Council have been doing some amazing work around the National Guarantee and inputting to the really big announcements that have come in ECEC in the States. And I think what's really exciting is for the first time, I think there's almost a congruence around all of these efforts. Like these initiatives are not standalone things that are happening blindly without any connection. They're deeply connected. They're deeply integrated. We're talking to each other. I know we've been, you know, through various members of the Catalyst, we've been engaging with the new government and with people who will be playing roles in developing the government's new national early years strategy and thinking about how we might be able to use this work as a meaningful input so that we don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to, it won't be a clean slate. I'm sure that there'll be really amazing processes that are developed for that work, but this will be really meaningful inputs, as will the other key activities that are being led by other players. Anything else that you'd add to that, Jane?
Only thing to add, and I completely agree with all of that, Penny. I think the lovely thing about this piece of work is these are the voices and experiences of people who actually deliver services with children. And there was a question in the Q&A about, can you run this in your own community? Yes, you can. And we'll provide the resources for you to do that. So what we're starting to see, as Penny said, voices from communities, from families, from parents, from service delivery, and from government coming together. And I think that is such a unique thing to feed into the early years strategy for Australia.
Thank you. Can I just go back to Fiona and Eve and ask you, when you're actually approaching this work, did you actually approach it with a set of hypotheses? And then a follow-up question is, how did you, taking that, how did you translate all of this material that you were learning into what we're seeing here? Did you play darts on the wall with what you were doing? How did you actually turn this into this, into this reality that we're seeing today. So give us a little bit of insight of how the sausage was made. And apologies to vegetarians. It was a vegetarian sausage, okay?
Thanks, Jeff. I think the really important thing with any participatory mapping is really to leave your own perspectives at the door, in terms of what you're trying to do is create a space for people to have conversations and really get their voice heard. And so the work for us, if we had any hypotheses, it was about how do we best create a space where people will feel comfortable to tell us what they really think. And how do we do that in a way that's going to generate new and meaningful insights? So probably the main thing, the one piece of framing we did up front was really think deeply about what are the questions that will trigger for us the most useful answers. And we actually adapted those, because we did initially get them wrong, in the sense that we were asking I think we still had our assumptions hidden in the questions. So we were asking quite narrow questions, and we realized that those big questions, like if you had a magic wand, what would you do differently, actually enabled people to bring whatever it is they wanted to bring to the table. And so that was a really interesting sort of learning over time. And for us, it was just constantly trying to improve how we made that happen. Eve, you might want to talk. Do you want to talk to the synthesizing, all the synthesizing work that went into this?
It was, as you will see, even from the report, a huge amount of sort of data that we gathered. And so we went through a sort of a process of sorting and thinking and sorting and thinking and going down some rabbit holes to sort of chase up was what we thought we were seeing is that sort of, so we did a bit of triangulation and a bit of testing as things sort of emerged, and just kept sort of funneling down and down, knowing that we were always going to go back and test what we'd found. So we sort of went through a process knowing that we could then share it back and say, have we captured this? Have we kind of got this kind of sort of right? Is this interpretation of what we've heard a reasonable reflection? And that was really valuable. And the sense-making process and then the sort of the testing back gave us more insight. So it's been a sort of an ongoing process, but there is a picture in the report of, like, it was spreadsheets down to another spreadsheet, down to another spreadsheet. It was masses of data that we just kept sort of sorting through.
And probably one of the final pieces of ground truthing before we took it out for the next set of testing is, once we'd done all the synthesizing and trying to create those headline stories, is we checked, could we find a quote? Could we go back and actually find a direct quote in the transcripts that we had that means we definitely we hadn't taken it too far from what people were saying? And so that was part of the process. If we couldn't find something back, if we'd gone off on a rabbit hole and we couldn't substantiate it back with the direct words of people from the field, we dropped it. So that for us was really important, that we weren't taking this too far away from what we heard.
Thank you. Jane and Penny, just one last question, and then we'll sort of move into the wrap-up session. There are a lot of questions coming in about now what? So what do we do now? What do we do with all this? I mean, this is significant work. There's a lot of lovely bouquets and comments coming in, Fiona and Eve, for you two. But the question of now what? What does the ECD field do with this knowledge? What do I do at a community level? What do we actually do with it? And I know you touched on it before, Jane, in terms of what we're doing next, but do either of you have any thoughts around that, or our experience as the early years catalyst as we've been grappling with exactly that?
Thanks, Jeff. And I think with such a comprehensive and detailed piece of work, the what next is the bit you grapple with, don't you? For us, I think there are a number of levels. There's feeding it into thinking about the systems and government, looking at policy and funding and system structure. Governance stewardship is definitely something that this is calling for, because we've got such acute examples of where they're not working well. But I think it's not just that, it's also services thinking about the role they take up in the system and what could they do differently as well. And then for communities, it's about them understanding the impact of these systems on their members of their communities, their families, the children, and then how they can articulate to others what they need. And this gives us a great insight into that. So for the Early Years Catalyst, what we'll be doing is feeding this into our strategy next. And the Early Years Catalyst itself will change in the next iteration to be able to connect really closely with communities, families, and children through up into feeding into how government is thinking about these systems. Penny, do you want to add to that?
Only to point out that one of the things that we were deeply excited by is some of the deep held beliefs and the attitudes and the way we view children, the way we value family, and the way we see the role of family in community and the role of government in family has sparked interest with many of us on the Catalyst, and we are really keen to explore that more deeply and to sort of understand that and possibly come up with some interventions that we might be able to put in place, whether we don't know what they'll be. I'm not even going to guess what they could be because it's so far out of the way we think about things at the moment. But we've got lots of interesting ideas to follow through. And as Jane said, I think the Catalyst is going to look different. And that's really exciting because it means we're being adaptive and being able to respond to what we're learning. So I think it's going to be an exciting time ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. So in terms of where to from here, from this point right now, just to reiterate, tomorrow, we're just waiting on the final graphic design to be done to tweak the last few pieces on what is a massive piece of work. There will be the report will actually be on our website, earlyyearscatalyst.org.au. I'd encourage you to please head for that. Feel free to email us on the email backbone@earlyyearscatalyst.org.au. We would love to hear from you. We're encouraging everyone to share that. The interactive maps are on there. In terms of the Early Years Catalyst, we've really heard this ambition from the field. That there is this desire out there to shift Australia's socio-cultural identity to a society that really does prioritize the well-being of all children. That's a challenge. It's a big challenge for us, and we're trying to think of that in terms of our work. We heard back from the field that the EYC needs to place its emphasis. So the Early Years Catalyst, we were convened to catalyze the field of early childhood development, and we need to focus on being a convening force. So that's what the field is calling us. That's not always comfortable or easy, but we're really focused on how do we do that? How do we work collectively? How do we unite in partnership with a broad voice and a depth of voice and voices that are not the usual suspects as well as the usual suspects? And how do we bring all of that together? Creating a shared roadmap and enabling and strengthening community-led decision making. So those were very clear calls to us, and we're including that. We're integrating that into our thinking. We talk about our own work as connecting, diagnosing, capacity and capability building, and amplifying the work that's already out there. And I don't want to go too much into that, but those are the areas that we are focusing on. We'd love to continue to discuss with you. So what we're doing is with these amazing people from Orange Compass, we're designing workshops that members of the Catalyst can actually come out and interact with you over. And we can actually help you to contextualize this work to your world, to where you're working. And we can learn more from it. That's what we get out of it, because we want to make sure we're getting that depth of voice and that breadth of voice. But we do want to help people to grapple with this work because we do believe it's significant. It's not just because we developed it, but because we found this genuinely challenging and thought-provoking and something that filled a real gap that we saw in the ECD field. So again, I encourage you, please feel free to download that report in full. We'll also be putting up the pieces you heard Fiona and Eve talking about, the rapid review of the evidence that was available to the field. That'll go up in the next week or so. We're doing a smaller condensed version for those with short attention spans to help around the, me too. So you'll be able to read a shortened version of the report to make it more accessible to people. You can sign up for websites, for email updates around the material on the website. And also this webinar will be available as a recording so you can share it. Everything we are doing is being shared under a Creative Commons license. That's really important to how we operate and who we are. And so, you know, we'll make sure we do that. Please feel free to stay in the loop. We'd love to hear from you. In wrapping up, I would like to actually acknowledge in particular Fiona and Eve for just months of work and having to, you know, when we started this, I don't know if you remember, but way back when we were facing a post-COVID reality. Does everyone remember when that was a reality, that we'd have a post-COVID reality and we could all start meeting together in person? We had to shift dramatically in the ways of working, and these two have just been so flexible and kept us trucking along with it, and it's actually been remarkable. So, and there's some amazing comments online, which I'll send through to the two of you as well, of people expressing their gratitude for the work and the insight. And so thank you. I want to acknowledge our co-chairs, Jane and Penny, for making time to be here and to participate, and for your insights and leadership for the Early Years Catalyst. Thank you. I want to acknowledge Sal and Michelle in the Backbone team, who've actually been going hammer and tongs to make this all happen at this time. It's just been so much work behind the scenes, and it's been amazing watching it actually all come to pass. And calling out the support crew from Social Ventures Australia, who've actually helped us get all of this set up and the platforms and the website. So George, Bree, Emma, Caitlin, you've just been an amazing support crew to have with us, and we're so grateful to work with you. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge everyone who made the time to come in here and be with us today. We're not here to build something. We're not here to build a remarkable organization, to be another remarkable organization amongst many remarkable organizations. We passionately believe that the field, right across the field, needs to be amplified and built up and celebrated for all of the remarkable things that are happening, and to see the ambition that sits within the field for a better system, for a system that actually puts children at the center and puts their needs at the center. Because our ambition, and it came clearly from the summit way back at our formation, is that by 2030, significantly more children, so significantly less children, are experiencing vulnerability and disadvantage, i.e. significantly more children are doing much better than they are now. And that's not to take anything away from the remarkable things that people are doing, but recognizing that despite all the amazing, incredible work, we're just not getting the level of systems change and systemic change and long-term change that we need to. And what we want to do is move into that space where we are fundamentally changing the nature of that. And that's exciting work. It's challenging work. I'd like to invite you to be part of that journey with us, to carry on this conversation. We'd love to continue it with you in your context. And thank you again for your time. Thank you again to Eve and Fiona. And I know that we can't hear any of you, but I'd like to give them all a round of applause. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. And everyone, please enjoy your afternoons. Thank you.